Next, we have our final guest in this Partner Connect session, and that's Ross Cathcart, who's the Organising and Membership Manager of Rethinking Economics, which is an international network which aims to make economics more democratic in society as well as in schools. So come on up, Ross. I shall get you now. Asking your permission to broadcast, and hopefully you will. Hi,
got me online.
you're on and good to go. So I shall leave you to talk about your organisation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Terry. And I actually think that this is actually quite a good point for Rethinking Economics to come into the conversation, because it links the two talks that we've already had quite well, I think. So, hello, I'm Ross, and I'm from a network called Rethinking Economics. I work in the international team there, and as Terry laid out, we're a student-led network that primarily campaigns to reform economics education. We work to diversify and reform the economics, the way in which it's taught and understood in the classroom, but also in society more widely. We started in around 2012, not in the form of a blog, but in the form of a booked out university room full of students dissatisfied with the limitations of the education that they're receiving. Today, we're an international network of over 100 groups. We're always growing. I've just had 2 calls before this session today where we were inducting new groups into a global network. We're based in almost 30 countries around the world. And we argue a case through a mixture of research, lobbying academic staff, direct action, and lots of other campaign tactics. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about what the problem is that we're trying to resolve, and also specifically in a bit more detail how Rethinking Economics works to try and solve it. So what's the problem? Typically across the world, regardless of whether you're in Johannesburg, New York, Jakarta, London, the likelihood is if you're a student in an economics classroom, you're going to learn one theory of economics as if it's fact. It's likely that you're going to be taught from one textbook normally per course. And as soon as you arrive in that lecture hall, your first microeconomics module or whatever, you'll probably be told either explicitly or implicitly, this is economics, this is the way economics works. And that's largely the same in most mainstream economics modules, regardless of where you take them. Ultimately, economics is presented as this discipline, even as a science that has itself sorted. Why is that a problem? Well, one saying that if you've been to Rethinking Economics talk before, you've heard this saying before. We repeat it ad nauseum a little bit, but there's nothing else that quite replaces it. If all you have is a hammer, all you'll see is nails. Students are presented with a narrow, limited understanding of what economics is, and that kind of, as you know, the other talks have talked about issues of climate change, issues of racial diversity, issues of racial injustice. You can pass through a whole undergraduate degree without necessarily discussing these. Now, don't get me wrong, what's taught in a economics course isn't a problem in and of itself, and we call it maybe mainstream economics or neoclassical economics, does things very well, understanding of markets, for example, but it's doing students a disservice and failing to equip them to apply their learning in later life by only focusing on that. And ultimately, this isn't just a problem with education. Those that study economics go on to not exclusively career in academia. In fact, that's only a very small proportion of people that graduate in economics. They go on to become politicians, civil service, business leaders, bankers, journalists. And those people then go on to shape kind of what we understand and conceive of economics in wider society. So, this economic common sense, which has allowed and created, I would argue, the development of multiple crises we face in terms of wealth, income inequality, stalling productivity, climate collapse. This is created and recreated within the classroom. There's a really great quote, again, something that we like to quote a lot, by Paul Samuelson, that says, I don't care who writes a nation's laws as long as I can write its textbook. So this stuff's really important. In not just educational terms, but also in the real world as well. So our role at Rethinking Economics is to push for an alternative economics education. We are building a movement of people who challenge, interrogate, renew kind of the practice of teaching and also what should be within our economics curricula. We work to expose students to a wealth of new economic ideas, economic alternatives, as well as organisations working on new economic issues. And Rethinking Economics is made up of students who are campaigning for this curriculum reform at their university, demanding education that is pluralist, has a variety of different perspectives, schools of thought, ways of thinking about this thing we call economics, that's critical and it's real world. It isn't talking in really abstract terms, but has real relevance to the world we see around them. We also work to diversify the people who study economics by reforming, by building sort of pathways that allow for people from underrepresented groups, both nationally but also internationally, by championing their voices to ensure that the people that become economists, become economic thinkers, that those new cohorts of students actually represent the people that they're ultimately going to serve. And in doing so, we hope we'll create a more just system generally. So yeah, I guess to sum up, our role is we work to empower, to impassion the next generation of economic thinkers. We're not creating economic alternatives. We're not a talking shop, but rather we're trying to create alternative economists. And if you're watching this and you're an economics student or you're recently graduated and you think, wow, this is speaking to me, I'd encourage you to get in touch. Go onto our website, rethinkecon.org, or search us in Google. I think I've misquoted our website, which is silly, but find us on Google, fill in the form and we'll get you inducted into our network. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Ross. That was great. Perfect. And so relevant to what we're doing with the festival. And I can see why you're such a great partner of promoting economic pluralism, which is Henry's baby. So Henry, you must come up and join us at some point in the next little chat. But I was going to start the ball rolling with the point that you make very clearly, that it's not just about Keynesian economics, basically, that it's getting to different theories of study and taking into account the social and political impacts. But to change that thinking, how the campaigns that you've done so far, what have you found has actually got through and resulted in some positive reactions?
So the level at which our campaigns are pitched vary quite considerably, and different actions have had different successes. So in all our local groups around the world, we run training sessions on upskilling them to approach their academic staff, discuss with them how can they reform the curricula at a very local level, and that has been successful in lots of ways, from changing the introductory reading list of courses to launching new modules, to in places like the University of Greenwich in London, reforming the whole undergraduate course. We also run various international campaigns. So I'd really encourage you to look at Economists for Future, which is a campaign we're incubating, which is calling on the economics discipline to recognise like sort of immediacy and urgency of climate collapse in its work. We actually worked with Positive Money and Hannah last year on a campaign called Rethinking the Role of Banks in Economics Education, which was a global open letter campaign which students submitted their academic staff in asking them to teach relevant and real world examples of kind of how banking works in practice, and was hugely successful. So there's a whole host of different tactics and approaches that we use across the world.
I see. And it is across the world that you're operating. So do you find there's a lot of shared issues that are being brought to the fore? What are the key ones?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the point I made in the talk, that I think regardless of where you're going into that introductory Econ 101 lecture, the fact that what you are learning will likely be the same. There won't be a huge amount of regional variation. Things will be discussed in very abstract, concepts and examples rather than have any relevance to the country in which you're in or the economic reality of where you're living. That is a commonality. I think, of course, with being in a global campaign, some of the specific examples and specific dynamics do vary. And I think a recent arm of a newer element of our campaign, of our network in recent years, has been to diversify and decolonize, recognizing that a lot of the models and economic thinking that are raised in those introductory lectures are very westernized and deal with things in a very exclusive, narrow perspective. I mean, a really good example is the household is like a base economic unit in a lot of the models we deal with. And that household is perceived as, 2 parents and 2 kids, roughly. Whereas when you when you look at lots of places in the global south, that household structure doesn't exist. They're much larger household units. So actually, at the base applicability of what people are learning has very little relevance to the world around them.
But something that has united everybody is COVID, and the impact of the pandemic has possibly created a new interest. That's what Henry's put in the Q&A as well, about for rethinking economics, to focus on the whole building back better with a different view of things. So, Henry.
Yeah, what made me think of this was that we have a regular columnist in the Mint magazine who's a A-levels teacher, and he was saying that in the school he's teaching, there's a sudden surge in demand for economics again, and this immediately made me think, oh yeah, that's what happened in 2008, 2009, out of which came Rethinking Economics. So, have you seen any of this coming through to your level in terms of more universities getting in touch, more, or do you think that's going to take a bit of time to feed through the system as fresh people are brought in and see the problem?
No, definitely. I think so. Part of it is that we hosted an online international festival earlier in the summer, and that brought in a lot of new people really interested and passionate to be involved. But certainly, I think that probably in the next round of people applying for university is going to be a huge increase, because, as you said, the date that I kind of gave as a starting point for the Rethinking Economics Network was 2012. That was sort of, people have lived through economic class in 2008, 2009. People were living through the Eurozone in free fall around that period, and got into their economics lectures and thought, right, this is where things are going to start making sense. And that certainly wasn't the case. And, parents knew they were studying economics and would say, can you explain this? Can you articulate better what is happening in the world? And them not having an answer to it. And I very much think we're going to see something similar happening today around, because when we look at, in the example of the UK, but an example of countries right around the world, the economic playbook has been torn up. That a new social contract has been written in lots of places about what we expect of government. And that it does not exist in most undergraduate and master's and even PhD courses, understanding kind of how that has come about and what it might look like. So, expect the floodgates to open, I think.
And this is so pertinent. Carolina's question is about, we should start talking about this at A-level stage, basically, and how can we apply pressure on the system. So, Carolina, come and have a chat to Ross yourself. If you can turn your camera and mic on, you will be able to join us. So she's asking about how can we apply pressure on the system so that this approach is started to be disseminated as early as possible.
So I think it's absolutely key, a really, really key question there, Carolina, which is we've done some workshops in secondary schools before, and the first question we ask is draw what you think an economist looks like. Draw what you think an economist looks like, and people go into their little groups and draw, and what you get is inevitably a man, sometimes wearing a top hat, sometimes with a monocle, standing on top of the world and holding a big cash. And so from that early age, this is like 15 or 16-year-olds or like 11 or 12-year-olds. There's a very specific image and perception of what an economist is. And for the majority of people, that is not them. So I think you're totally right that by the time people are applying to and entering the undergraduate economics education, there's a whole tranche of people who have already thought economics isn't for me.
Exactly.
So it's a really key point. And we are beginning to do some work to address that. Going into schools, we did a pilot last year within some secondary schools in London, and are hoping to do that in some other secondary schools in the UK. But those resources, we're looking at how we can internationalize them, and how we can make them freely available for rethinking groups right around the world. But yeah, it's a root of these systemic problems is how early it starts, how early these perceptions are drilled down into children.
I'd like to add, if that's okay, that I think actually at the A-level syllabus is much easier to influence and pluralize than the undergraduate one.
Absolutely.
What's really interesting is that A-level, there isn't the maths. They just don't do the maths. And really, at undergraduate, they do the A-level syllabus with just tons of maths in it. And the maths just takes up all the space. Whereas the A-level, it's actually, I think, a lot easier for teachers to add in different elements and so on. And they have a specific bit on behavioral economics. They have a specific bit on development economics. And actually, we're working with a A-level teacher who, and Ross, it'd be great to chat to you about this actually, but to try and take particular bits of the A-level syllabus and produce material and suggested readings and exercises in classrooms and things like this. So there's a sort of teaching plan, if you like, with material that we're going to start putting on the Mint Magazine website and trying to publicize. So to give it, because the thing with A-level teachers as well is they're incredibly stressed and have very little space. So we've talked to quite a lot of teachers, A-level teachers, and what they've said is, give us a teaching plan. Give us something really specific we can sort of just like unpack from the box, if you like, and just roll out. And I think that we're also working with a group called Tutor to You, who do all the A-level teaching. You're smiling, so you must know them quite well. And trying to use them. They have a lot of interface with economics teachers at A-level all around the place. And that's one of the challenges, is actually you can always find an email for academics at university and find them, but actually teachers at A-level are quite difficult to actually get to, you know, and find a way of communicating with them.
And also in a way, sorry, they also have a lot more constraints in terms of curriculum and what they can supposedly seem to be able to teach, or what topics to talk about, depending on the school and, you know, the resources they have, the time that they have, how many students they have, you know. But also, I also feel that economics, I did economics at university a century ago, and you know, in that country in Central America, a very different approach as well to what my kids, who have both done the A-level economics, have had. So yet still very one-sided, one type of economics taught.
I think both of what you're saying as well is what I was going to touch on, is making economics a bit sexier. You know, the maths puts people off incredibly. I mean, and I think it's also, it hides, not hides, but covers the behavioral, the social impact side of life, which is what you're trying to, you know, make more pluralist approaches are based on, the diversity and the shared thinking.
Exactly.
It's an interesting point, that, Terry, that, and there's a whole sociological rabbit hole we can go down. But like when I was talking about how, you know, economics is power, if you have to understand the economy, be able to be a voice on economic matters is very powerful. And Ha-Joon Chang, a really great development economist that I'd encourage you to look at, he always says 90% of economics is common sense. And we don't expect to have a PhD in gender studies to have an opinion on same-sex marriage. We don't expect to have a PhD in international relations to have an opinion on the Iraq War. But there is this societal expectation to kind of like understand economics. We've got spent 7 years in a dark room reading, however many textbooks. That's a real problem as well, that people feel like they're not equipped to speak on economic issues. And part of that is because of the maths, I think. It's obstructed by text.
Absolutely.
And the way I think it's taught, isn't it? Because this is the big problem, is that it's taught as if you have to learn all this theory, all this technical stuff before you can, begin to understand the economy. And that also means that when you say, well, let's do pluralism, they say, well, we've got no time because we've got to cover all this other stuff. And then you wanted to do all this more stuff. Whereas actually, if you start and say, let's look at what's happening in the world, actually examples that people relate to, and start trying to think about them as economic activities and how we can understand them. And then naturally you actually bring different perspectives, different thinking about it, and people can relate to it and get knowledge and start to read and so forth. And pluralism is just the norm, you know, it's just, you couldn't do it without pluralism.
That's the dream. That's the dream. I've got conscious of time, and there's a couple of questions still remaining. I mean, are we okay to carry on? I think it's a really good conversation, this, and I think it'll be valuable to get Edna and Wasima up, both of them up now, to ask their questions, if that's all right. So I'll just get Edna. Hello, Edna. Can you put your mic on? And where's Wasima? Because they've both got some really good questions to add to the conversation.
Yeah.
So, Edna, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, mine was not really a question, but just following up on what Ross said about, you know, the economic models and the, you know, how it's taught. And really, when you look at different parts of the world, things are totally different, and most of these things are not applicable. And I think I'll add on what you've just said, Terry, that no, it's Henry was said that if in class people could just open up discussions, you know, like, and say, in this context, we look at our economy or the situation here, and try to discuss and look at what can be applied here, which cannot be applied in another place. I think not just in economics, but in most of the courses and classes that we've attended, no one really looks at the real life situation. It's about the books, what, who said what, who these you know, economists or theorists said this. Yeah, so I think it's the initiative that Ross and others are doing can really, you know, work well. You know, if young people could start looking at things practically and in very contextual. Thank you.
Oh, lovely. Yes. So, Wasima, you had views on having just graduated with an economics degree. You are fresh to the mill. So
yeah,
off you go.
So I just wanted to ask how you feel that you can influence the way economics is taught at the degree level, considering that most lecturers have like PhDs and masters of economics taught at like a neoclassical, classical level, and for them to be able to teach pluralistic economics with as much depth, so it's sufficient for students to learn pluralistic economics with, you know, a similar level of depth as they teach neoclassical or classical economics. So how do you think you can sort of like change that within undergraduate courses?
So it's a really good question, and it kind of gets to the core of some of the difficulties we face as a campaign, which is essentially that, you know, the hiring practices and the, you know, the amount of a career that goes into building someone up to be in position with providing a lecture. That is a much longer process than it is the 3-4 years that someone's in a course. And also, certainly in the UK, but in a lot of the world, as education becomes increasingly consumerized and greater pressures are placed on lecturers, somebody saying, hang on, stop the car, why aren't we talking about X, Y, and Z? Lecturers can, you know, it's a question of capacity as well as sort of academic background, as you'd said. And the answer that I had to that, and the answer that I gave when we're in conversations with Rethinkers, because this is a really a recurring question, is in campaigns, I think we can be swamped by thinking about what the end goal is. We can see look at our vision and think, how am I possibly going to get there? That is so far off. But actually, what Rethinking Economics tries to provide, and what our strategy tries to provide, is a roadmap, a series of steps, and a series of incremental changes to moving towards that. And you're right that I think going to your lecturer and saying, pluralize your course, pluralize your lecture, they'll be accommodating and be polite, but will say, I can't do that. And they're probably right. And what we work to do is make clear what those incremental steps can be. And that can start from a simple thing as, on an introductory reading list, having Kate Raworth's Donut Economics as a book there, that it sparks that interest in somebody. And I think that this kind of speaks to Edna's point before in a really important way, that as students and as young economists, we actually hold a lot of power in these institutions. And our role isn't always to have the answer, but it's to be the one that asks the question. It's to be the one that says, why aren't we being taught this? I'm interested in this, where should I go? And there's a lot of power in that, and great things can come of it.
And I think just to add to Ross before we finish, just that
I'm just going to bring Sanya back in as well.
Sorry, just that innovation theory always says that incumbents are incredibly bad at innovation because they, as Ross was saying, they're so deeply entrenched in the status quo, they cannot change. And obviously it's the people who are actually challengers, who are willing to do things differently, and building them up and their capacity and status is also, I think, a key part of the strategy. And that is also difficult, has lots of difficulties in its own way, but must be part of the strategy as well. So people can go to places like Greenwich, but also you can find areas in the places like LSE, that actually are willing to do different sorts of stuff and show different models of how it's totally possible. It's not something that's difficult, that is that difficult actually.
I think you said it earlier, is you have to make it practical and real, provide the tools and they will come if you wish. But I think I just wanted to bring Sanya on, if you're okay, Sanya, because just to round it off to a final flourish with the education focus, because Hannah's had to leave now. So Sanya, welcome back, because as an ex-LSE graduate, I know, but also given what Ross has said, how does that fit in with the Citizens Foundation work in terms of getting a different view of economics? Is that something that you've come across?
I have to be honest with you. We, our schools are up till 10th grade. So I can't really speak for economics beyond that, because to be honest, I'm not aware to what level they study economics while they are in school. I can only speak from my own experience, growing up in Pakistan and learning economics. And I do think that I think someone else brought up this point. It's so important to kind of study the current environment and study, the current situation history is very important too, but I think that a lot of times in classroom that debate does not take place. And a lot of the understanding, especially now, which is why I think there's something like this Festival for Change, and especially this conversation that we have going about how to rebuild the economy and how to rebuild the world is so important, because for our students, coming back to school, it is the amount of stress and anxiety they must have gone through. There's so much uncertainty. Working in business, there's so much uncertainty for us. I can't imagine what it's like to grow up in a world like this. So I think that it's so important that these conversations take place, and even economics or even curriculum, I think just across the board should be consistently revised and updated. And that's something that we do at TCF, because I think it's important for things to stay relevant and for these conversations to happen inside and outside the classroom.
Well, Sanya, maybe we should have a conversation afterwards about maybe how if we can help in any way.
Oh, definitely.
In terms of introducing material or support or training your teachers or anything you might need, because it'd be a great pilot to do something like that in Pakistan that could then happen elsewhere. And the fact that you have this huge capacity and huge coverage, and possibly an interest, then maybe there's a project, there's possible of a project there to collaborate on.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes, with Ross. I think we should get everybody together. So listen, that was fascinating, and sorry it's gone on a wee bit longer than we had scheduled, but I think it was worth it. Thank you, Sanya. Thank you, Ross, and thank Hannah as well, who has had to go. But we will call it a day. But we can go to the tables if you can stay on, if you would like to have more of a chat. Okay. Thanks, Carolina, for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. We'll break these up and put recordings with the different slots in for all the partners. so people
Yes.
can find them. Thanks very much.
Great.
Yes.
Bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. Bye-bye.